Veronica froze for a minute, thinking that was her end. How did she get to this point? What was the person going to do to her? The voice mentioned her again, Vera. Then Vera gained consciousness, and turned only to find Mr. Happy's son, Jeff, standing behind her with a smile. "Oh my gosh. You scared me." "How long have you been standing behind me?" Vera asked. Jeff, now smiling, knowing he at least scared Vera, asked her, "Seriously, Vera, what are you doing outside at this time of the night? And you are pregnant?" Veronica, now murmuring and could not find the right words to say, with a shaky voice, "I only came out for some fresh air and wanted to call my husband so we could talk. Nothing else," Veronica gathered courage to say. Then Jeff escorted her to her door and said good night. Veronica responded, but still shivering. She thanked God for keeping her safe and asked for wisdom. She immediately called her husband that night and told him she recorded them this time. And she will have to find a way to tell the tenants about it, and what will the consequences be. As she laid her head on her pillow, she felt a strange presence in the room. A strange ghostly figure this time came to attack her. As a courageous, prayerful woman, and with her dog barking, she stood her ground, took anointing oil and prayed and sprinkled the anointing oil on the ghostly figure, and it disappeared. "Oh my God, I have become a threat to whatever is hovering around this estate. God, please help me," she said to herself. But the tenants must be freed and saved from all these. Jeff, Mr. and Mrs. Happy's only son, was a student at one of the prestigious universities in town and was a very handsome gentleman with a jovial character. And as the only heir to his parents' wealth, he usually comes around to visit his parents and to check on the development, tenants, and management of the estate to make sure all is well. That night he met Veronica. He had left campus late and got to the estate late at midnight and saw Veronica, the tenant, walking down the street, and just decided to be jovial by trying to scare her. And that was how he ended up escorting her to her door. Jeff had come to spend 1 week to oversee every management of the estate and had no idea the shocking revelation ahead about his parents. Mr. and Mrs. Happy had once had a poor background, coming from a family on both sides, where their families struggled to even feed. So when Mr. and Mrs. Happy met and decided to become couples, they vowed to be rich and help their families out of poverty. They tried everything as a couple, but nothing worked out. For 5 years in marriage, with no child yet, and no wealth, they became frustrated, going from one place to the other for help, but to no avail. Until one day, Mrs. Happy was on her way from the market when she helped an elderly, sophisticated woman, nicely dressed with a Porsche car, looking very rich. Her kindness touched the woman's heart, and she decided to help Mrs. Happy. The woman invited Mrs. Happy home, and their conversation ended that the woman can take her out of all their misery and even help her conceive together with getting wealth, but on one condition. She and husband will have to do something in exchange for all that as thanksgiving for the help she will render them. Mrs. Happy thanked her and left. Mrs. Happy got home and told her husband all that she was told by the rich woman. The husband was hesitant at first, but later agreed and asked, "So, what was that exchange?" She said. Before she could finish her sentence, there was a knock at their door. A debt collector had come knocking heavily on their door to collect her money. They were able to pay that day because the rich woman gave Mrs. Happy some money. And they both realized money can solve all their problems. But they just weren't patient enough. The next morning, Veronica went to Mrs. Happy and told her she wanted to have some short meeting with the tenants. But she told them it was a surprise. Before the meeting, Veronica had shown the video to 2 tenants who were shocked and surprised and decided to support her. On the day of the meeting, everyone gathered, including Mr. and Mrs. Happy and their only son Jeff. Veronica had requested for a flat TV screen and a projector to show all of them what she had. Before showing it, she apologized to Mr. and Mrs. Happy and all the tenants for what they are all about to see, but, before she could finish talking, the main power for the whole estate went off. There was total darkness everywhere, and everyone was disappointed and left. Veronica and her 2 supportive tenants stayed behind, disappointed and wondered why, but took another decision to save the tenants and their destinies. Veronica and her team decided to forward the video of the landlady and her husband chanting on each member's shoe or slippers they had taken to chance on them and returned them back to each tenant individually with a text to save their destinies, and that she believed Mr. and Mrs. Happy were doing something against each tenant's. They all concluded that is why every tenant's life changed for the worst before they left the estate. The tenants then decided to confront Mr. and Mrs. Happy to ask questions. On that Saturday morning, all the tenants angrily gathered, including Veronica, to demonstrate and confront them and ask why they did that to their shoes and slippers, and what have they been doing to them. It took the intervention of the police their son Jeff had called to come and prevent any catastrophe. When Mr. and Mrs. Happy was confronted and the tenants demanded an explanation, that was when they begged and explained it all. But after they got the wealth and son from the rich woman, the woman and her group demanded that we chant on our tenants' slippers or shoe to get their good destinies of wealth, glory and power, so ours will keep going up. The tenants were so angry, but the police calmed them down and Mr. and Mrs. Happy apologized. Each tenants begun leaving the estate and vowed never to leave their sandals and shoes outside wherever they will rent and be very prayerful. And so the whole estate, including all their other estates that brought them wealth, became desolate. Months later, Veronica gave birth to a baby girl. One day as she was coming back from the hospital after checkup, she saw Mrs. Happy looking very worried and simple walking by the roadside. Veronica got down from her car and called her. She didn't recognize Veronica, but Veronica introduced herself, and it was then tears started coming from Mrs. Happy as she narrated what their lives have gone through after that ordeal. Her husband was sick and their son had to go to a different school and yet to graduate. Veronica felt sorry and took her number. Veronica, knowing the power of God as a prayerful woman, decided to talk to her pastor to help her pray for Mrs. Happy and her family to break them free from any occultic and satanic power so they could get back on their feet. One fine morning, Veronica called Mrs. Happy that she wanted to pay her a visit. Upon arriving there, the pastor sensed the presence of a demonic aura around them because they broke the rule of their wealth, and hence had decided to take everything away from them and bound their souls. The pastor together with Veronica prayed so hard and cried to God to release the family from any spiritual attack and bondage on their lives. And by the power of God, the family was freed from the demonic spirit. They started attending church, and before a year, their lives were restored back. It was never the same, but better than before, because the power of God to give wealth adds no sorrow to it. Never leave your shoes or sandals outside at night, you may never know.